how this works is, when we discussed Imam Abu Hanifa, it was incumbent that we would talk briefly on the seerah, and then how it manifested into his teachers and where Imam Abu Hanifa got his knowledge from. If you can recall from last month, we said that Muhammad ﷺ was a teacher of all the Sahaba. And there's no way I can explain that as a recap. There's no such thing as recapping on the life of Muhammad ﷺ before you start another topic. And one of his prominent students was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhu, the Sahaba. From the seerah, we learned that at the time, Muhammad ﷺ, he left a lot of Sahaba in charge of many things. He said Mu'adh bin Jabal is a'lamu bil halal wal haram. So Mu'adh bin Jabal was designated for the Sahaba that if they wanted to know what was halal and what was haram, they would go to Mu'adh bin Jabal. Now, when it comes to the matters of fiqh, when it comes to the matters of jurisprudence, or it comes to the matters of rules and regulations from the Quran and the Sunnah, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of them, and that's who the Sahaba used to go to. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud moved to Kufa, and from there he had students, and those students taught other students, and their student was Imam Abu Hanifa. So those of you who choose to follow the Hanafi madhab or were born into the Hanafi madhab, it goes back to the madrasa and the fiqh of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. Now comes Medina. As the Sahaba dispersed to different areas, there happened to be a Sahabi who stayed in Medina but who didn't want to leave Medina. That was Abdullah ibn Umar, who was the son of Umar radiallahu anhu. Right? So Abdullah ibn Umar was, again, he was the peg, he was the stamp of Medina, the son of Umar radiallahu anhu. He taught who he taught, and his most prominent student was whom? Nafi'. Nafi', this is actually something phenomenal. Nafi' was actually the slave of Abdullah ibn Umar. But slavery at that time was not slavery to now, or was previously. Slavery, the Western understanding, was based on a certain race or a color or some type of degradation. But slavery at that time was an international law and was not limited to any race or anything like that. It's just the way the world used to work back then. Okay? So it just happens to be the most prominent student of Abdullah ibn Umar was Nafi'. Okay? The student of Nafi' was who? Malik bin Anas. So Malik bin Anas, who was the Imam of the Maliki madhab, his student was a freed slave. His teacher was a freed slave, who was the student of Abdullah ibn Umar. So it works like the madrasa or the school of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The one who remained in Medina was Abdullah ibn Umar. From Abdullah ibn Umar learned Nafi'. Nafi' was his student. Nafi''s student was Malik bin Anas, who was a tabi'i, rahimahullah. So that fountain was a very sacred fountain, and we're going to learn about that, inshallah. Imam Malik, again, this was supposed to be, an hour and a half with the prayer break in between, but there's no way I can do any justice about talking about the Imam of Al-Medina, the Imam of Dar al-Hijrah. He was given that title, the Imam of Dar al-Hijrah, for many reasons which we're going to cover also. This person, Imam Malik, his lineage goes back to Arab tribes from Yemen, from his father's side. His great-grandfather was actually a Sahabi. His name was Abu Amir. Abu Amir was a Sahabi. He engaged in all events with Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam except for Badr. So his Islam was slightly late from the beginnings. But he witnessed all the events with Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam except for Badr. His grandfather's name was Abu Amir. His father was also one of the people, one of the tabi'een, who carried Uthman radiallahu anh to his grave at night. There were 4 people, and his father was one of them. His father originally comes from a tribe from Yemen named the Asbah. That was the name of his tribe, his father. And his mother comes from a tribe which is also from an Arab lineage. Her name was Sharik. Okay, or Aliyah bint Sharik was her name. She also came from a tribe of the Arab descent. Amongst the tabi'een, like I said, that carried Uthman, radiallahu anhu, Uthman, he passed away way later than when Muhammad passed away. So from the people who saw the Sahaba were the tabi'een. So he comes from this fountain, which is a very, very sacred fountain, and that understands his culture of Muhammad very well. Imam Malik, just on a side note, he never left Medina, nor did he ever want to leave Medina. He said, I will be afraid of passing away. There's two things we learn from this. Not only his conviction that he can be taken away anytime from Allah, but his love for Muhammad also. He said, I'm afraid that I may leave the boundaries of Medina and the angel of death may grab my soul and I'm going to die outside of Medina. And this was an honor. This is why, I originally feel that I am somebody who follows the evidences of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, from amongst the 4 Imams. But my favorite out of all of them is Imam Malik. And we're going to find out why. His personality, his drive, his zeal, he was the closest in himself, his personality, to Umar radiallahu anhu. So begins his beginning of knowledge was not like Imam Hanifa. Imam Hanifa, as you guys probably remember from last month, he had a push from Imam Shahab, who said that, I see some type of, you're a gifted person, I see many qualities inside of you to be from amongst our scholars. That's what was said to Imam Hanifa. But Imam Malik was born in a family of scholars, so it was kind of given to him easily, in a way. It didn't mean that he didn't strive for it, but it was right at his doorstep. So it made it a lot easier. It made it a lot easier for him to absorb his knowledge. Like all of the Imams, and which is a tradition now, they all start with Hifz al-Quran, and that's how he started, Imam Malik. He started with the Hifz al-Quran, and it happens to be Nafi', who is the teacher of Imam Malik, is also one of the prominent scholars of Qira'at, as far as the Quran is concerned. One of the riwayat of Qira'at is called Nafi'. Okay? He is the ustad of this. So Imam Malik had this chain of narration of Ijaza in Tajweed from Nafi'. And he also learned from him Hadith. Okay? After he started sitting with scholars, at this time period, in his early stages, he came across a scholar whom he loved so much named Rabi'at al-Ra'i. And he learned what was then considered basics, but now, whatever the basics were back then, they'd be the top scholar of the world, actually. So the basics was studied with Rabi'at al-Ra'i. And I'm mentioning these names, so if we happen to hear these names again, we realize that we have this culture of Islam and we should know these names. I don't expect everyone to know all these names, but this influx of names that's going to come to you, inshallah, my goal is that you remember just a few of them, 4 or 5 of them. Is because this is how we've received our deen, through these people who were the preservers and the torchbearers of this deen. Okay? After that, he came across somebody else who was a tabi'i, who was a qari. And when I say qari, it means he has ijazah in Quran. He read the Quran, which was read by the Sahaba, which was read by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The reason why this is very important is that ijazah of Quran is far more stronger than the ijazah of hadith. What does ijazah mean? Ijazah means, for instance, in hadith, that I heard from my teacher, and his teacher heard from him, and he heard from him, and he heard, and went all the way to the Sahaba, and it ends at Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's the ijazah in hadith. Ijazah linguistically means permission, which means you have permission to teach now. Because you heard from your sheikh, and he heard from him, he heard from him, he heard from the Sahaba, he heard from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the ijazah in Quran is very, very important. It's because if I hear from my sheikh, and he hears from his sheikh, and it keeps on going on, and they heard from a group of the Sahaba, and the Sahaba heard from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then where does it end? Then they hear from Jibreel alayhi salam, and Jibreel alayhi salam was told this by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if somebody gets an ijazah in tajweed, the beginning, the ending of this ijazah is your name, and the top is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which means that you read this exactly the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave this to Jibreel, and the way Jibreel gave this to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this was the ijazah that Imam Malik had from Nafi'. And it was very small. The chain of narration was so small then, right? Imam Malik to Nafi', to Abdullah bin Umar, to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to Jibreel, to Allah azza wa jalla. Only 6 people, right? And that's how close they were. And this is something very phenomenal. If we just leave with this understanding, this is enough for us to go home and think about this for another month, inshallah. So Imam Malik was very impressed by his teacher named Abdullah ibn Hurmuz. This is a very unique name, so it'll be easy for you to remember. Abdullah ibn Hurmuz. He was a tabi'i, he was a qari, which means he had ijazah in tajweed, and he was a muhaddith, meaning he was very in depth with this understanding of hadith. Abdullah ibn Hurmuz was one of those people who, his teacher, who heard from Abu Hurairah. He heard from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Who's heard these names before? Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Very prominent in Bukhari, very prominent in Sahih Muslim, very prominent in Muwatta Imam Malik and many other hadith. Okay? So his teachers that he had, and he had this blessing of living in Medina, so he was surrounded by these people who were taught by the Sahaba. Right? And his seriousness in this ilm, even from a young age. Just small details of his life. Do you know that Imam Malik, just in order to buy books and pens and paper to write on, he sold the roof and the ceiling of his house. He sells this very shelter that he needs, the shelter of instinct. This instinct, he gets rid of a part of it just so you and I can be spoon-fed this preserved knowledge of hadith and fiqh. And this is what he did. Just to buy books and just for his travels, he sold the roof of his house so he can attain knowledge, and he became what he became. But his main teacher, as long as we're talking about his teachers, was Nafi' that we mentioned. And this is the silsila, this is the chain of narration, hadith, of which we're going to talk about later, inshallah, which is called the silsila al-dhahabiyya. This is the golden chain of narration. And Imam Bukhari and many other scholars of hadith said that this is the strongest chain of narration without a doubt. You can't get any stronger than this. And the Muwatta Imam Malik is full of this chain of narration. This chain of narration is that Imam Malik heard from Nafi', and Nafi' heard from Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Umar heard from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So with the agreement of the muhaddithin, this is the strongest chain of narration. You can't get any stronger than this gold. And he happened to possess this chain of narration, and his book, Al-Muwatta Imam Malik, is full of this, is full of these chains. He stayed with the Nafi' for 12 years. And it wasn't just a 12 years where, oh, okay, I go once a month or once a week. He said that I would be in the shade, I would try to get shade, and I would stand outside of his house from a tree. And there were no leaves on these trees, so I would stand right outside of his house with the Medina, the desert heat beating on me, and I would wait for him to come out of his house. As soon as he came out of his house, he would walk to the masjid to give his dars, so that's when I would approach him, making sure no one else can get in the way, and I would ask him as many questions as I can. Now imagine this relationship. He said that I would ask these questions, and the root of all these questions, the base of all these questions would be, what did Abdullah ibn Umar say about this? Imagine that honor. What did Abdullah ibn Umar say about this? What did Abdullah ibn Umar say about this? Until I exhausted him. And then he would go and sit in his dars, and after he got out of his dars, I'd follow him to his house, asking him, what did Abdullah ibn Umar say about this? What did Abdullah ibn Umar have to say about this? And he would give me the rulings of Abdullah ibn Umar and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So he began with the asking of Abdullah ibn Umar. So what was this that he was asking? When you ask a teacher what Abdullah ibn Umar said, that means you're asking for the fatawa of the Sahaba. Where did this originate from when we hear, oh, there's a fatwa on this and there's a fatwa on that? This obviously started from the time when Muhammad ﷺ gave training to the Sahaba, and when he wasn't present, they would absorb what Muhammad ﷺ would say, and they would give their fatwa, meaning this religious verdict or this religious opinion. And this understanding comes from when Muhammad ﷺ sent Mu'adh bin Jabal to Yemen. Mu'adh bin Jabal was one of the amazing Sahaba that Muhammad ﷺ said, go to Yemen and you're going to be in charge of the Muslims of Yemen. So he said, what are you going to rule by? Mu'adh bin Jabal. This is what Muhammad ﷺ said to Mu'adh bin Jabal. He said, I'm going to rule by the book of Allah. And he said, فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدْ, and what if you don't find it inside of it? He said, then, بِسُنَّةِ نَبِيِّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ, by the sunnah of his Nabi. And he said, what if you don't find it in there? What if it's something new that didn't arise before? Then he said, I'm going to do ijtihad by myself, and I'm going to pass my religious ruling or opinion or verdict. And then Muhammad ﷺ praised him for that, and he said, go on your way. So this understanding of fatwa started at the time of Muhammad ﷺ. And he gave them ijazah, he gave them permission to do this. So when we talk about the fatwa of the Sahaba, Nafi' took all the fatwas of Abdullah ibn Umar and he passed it down to Imam Malik. So Imam Malik, the first study he did with his teacher Nafi', who was a tabi'i also, was studying the fatwas of the Sahaba. But it wasn't only the fatwas of Abdullah ibn Umar that he knew. And we're talking about Nafi' here. He knew the fatwa of other Sahaba also. But he specialized in the sayings of Abdullah ibn Umar, who was the son of Umar radiallahu anhu. And then he also learned with him what we call ilm al-riwayah. Ilm al-riwayah in usul al-hadith, or mustalah al-hadith, which is a study of hadith, is the text itself and how to delve deep inside of that text. Imam Malik studied this from a Nafi', who studied from who? The study of who? Abdullah ibn Umar. Who was Abdullah ibn Umar's father? I can't hear you guys. Umar radiallahu anhu. Just making sure we're having some absorption here also, inshallah. He said, and look at, from a very young age, he had these principles that he never changed even until he died. See, we have to remember that this placement that Allah does on this dunya for all people, it has a role and there's a hikmah inside of it. It just so happens to be after the generation of the Sahaba, that whole generation of 200 years, its specialty was in fiqh. Meaning that's where all the fuqaha were born, and that's when they passed away until almost 300 after Hijri. And then after that were the ulama of hadith. That's what the time the ummah specialized in. And then was the time of tafsir and everything else. So this time of fiqh that was there after the age, or at the time of the tabi'een, was the age where everything for the ummah, as far as fiqh, that's where it originated. And it's almost as if they got so far there that it ended over there. Everything after that, we based off those principles. So the principles that we have now, that we base our fiqh off of, was based off that original time. Okay? And those were the ulama that played this role of the ummah. So Imam Malik, he says, that I came across 70 different people who sit on the pillars of the Masjid al-Nabawi and say, Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. What does this mean? He said that I see, and I came across 70 different people teaching at these pillars. Who's ever been to Medina, they know that there's tons of pillars there, right? There's original pillars there. The original pillars from there, people used to teach the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, teach hadith. And he said, from these pillars, I've seen 70 people that said, Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that said, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said. And he said that I didn't give any of them attention. He said that they were very trustworthy people. They were amazing people. If you trust them with your home, you would trust them. But they were not fit to teach the ilm of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So I refused to learn from them. Even though they were amazing people. Again, that time called for this type of strictness. That he was very careful who he took his ilm from. And is that very carefulness that he had of how he preserved that ilm very well. He said, I am living in Medina, the land where Muhammad ﷺ passed away, and his Sahaba. There's no way I can have any leniency with who I take my ilm from. So as of right now, I'm taking from a selected few, and one of them is Nafi'. After he reached and attained a level of ilm, after learning with Nafi', after the knowledgeable maturity, after the stage of confidence, after the stage where he saw now that I feel I need to stomach this responsibility and hadith is not being taught the way it's supposed to be taught. He didn't say I'm teaching because I'm better. He said I see many shortcomings in the way people are teaching hadith, so I have to stomach this responsibility, and now I'm going to begin to start teaching hadith. But before I do that, I have to get ijazah. I have to get permission. So what was his way of getting permission? He said, I went to 70 of the top jurists, in some of the riwayat say 90 ulama that are of fiqh, that are of hadith, that are of tafsir, and I read to them what I knew, I taught to them what I knew, and they said, you've surpassed us, you have ijazah from all of us to start teaching in the Masjid al-Nabawi, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Do you think he went and he celebrated and he took a break? He was overcome with a mountain of responsibility now, right? And he was so strict in who he took his ilm from, as you mentioned, that he was so careful on even what he said. So he said, to rectify this and to make myself strong, he sat in Medina where Umar radiallahu anhu used to sit. And that's where he used to teach from. Imagine that. You're just a few generations away from Umar radiallahu anhu, and he said, to keep myself strong, and for the honor of living in Medina, I'm sitting where Umar radiallahu anhu sat, and that's where I'm going to teach from. He got an opportunity, and that's where he lived. He lived in the room of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. That was his hujrah. That's where his living place was. He said, I'm going to live where Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is going to live. So he lived there. And again, this is taking outsourcing your raghbah, your zeal, and putting yourself in this situation, and you're confining yourself so you can't stray from any way. And that was by sitting where Umar sat and living where Abdullah ibn Mas'ud used to live. His dars. And adhan is going to be in a few minutes, inshallah. So we're going to conclude in a few minutes. And after the salah, we're going to continue for another hour, inshallah, or an hour and a half after salah. Okay? So going back, his dars, his teaching, what was his teaching method, and how did he conduct his classes after he attained this humongous responsibility? His first dars, he used to have 2 dars throughout the day. Number 1 was for the dars of hadith. And the dars was for the dars of what? Fatwa. And when we say fatwa, it means that he's teaching the fatwa of the Sahaba, which is actually Sharia, and we're going to learn that in his usul, because the Sahaba understood the doings of Muhammad ﷺ in a certain way. And they would extract that from the life of Muhammad ﷺ and give those to people. So he had one class specifically for that, and answering questions. People would ask him questions, and they would say, what's the ruling on this? And he would pass his ruling. So that's how he would conduct his class. And that's how he partitioned it, basically. There's different narrations on this, but it was said to be that to the last days of his life, he only devoted to hadith and no fatwa. Because he said, I feel I'm getting older, and I don't want to be teaching anything but the words of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's what they said, that's what some of the riwayat say that he would teach at the end of his life. So in preparation for his dars of hadith, all of his students agreed to the fact that before he would come to his dars, he would take a ghusl. He would take a bath. He would wear the best of perfumes. He would wear the most elegant clothing that he had. Not out of vanity, out of arrogance, because he's presenting people with the life and the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so he wanted to be fully prepared, outwardly and inwardly. And he used to make sure before he got there that they'd be burning something called oud. You know, burning a certain type of wood or a certain type of oil with a very nice scent. And that would continue on throughout his whole dars. And when he would walk, and look at this carefulness that he had for teaching the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even walking to the masjid, they realized that when he would come to this dars, this walking would be completely different than all of his other pacings and walkings. When he would walk, he'd walk very slow, he'd look down, his face was red, and he would approach the masjid of the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the days that he was sick, he started teaching from his home. But as of right now, we're discussing this area of Masjid al-Nabawi, where he had the honor of teaching. And Imam Malik, he was completely different than Imam Abu Hanifa in a certain way. Imam Abu Hanifa, if you guys remember from last month, we talked about they were the people of Ra'i, so they would talk about very hypothetical things and apply them to the Sharia and see what the Sharia would say about them. Like one of the things that they would talk about in the majlis of Imam Abu Hanifa was that if, and this is Imam Abu Hanifa saying this to the group of his students, he would say that if you were to be on the moon, which direction would you pray? Okay? And they would all argue and debate. This is his way of teaching. He would make sure they debate and exhaust all their mental faculties on this mas'ala, and then he would give them the answer. And he would say that as long as you're in the direction of the earth, that's all that matters. Now, the Malikis, the people of Medina, their usul, their way of debate was completely different. Imam Malik didn't like going near hypothetical things. And this is where the two schools differ. That the Hanafis, they're very big on trying to come up with new masail, new issues, and tackling those issues. Imam Malik was not that way. He said, we have all the abundance of hadith. We have all the Sahaba living here. There's no need, as of right now, to waste our time on this. And you have to remember, where was the placement of Imam Malik? It was in Medina, in the desert, right? And they still had that culture of that Bedouin-like culture, and I don't mean it in a negative connotation, but that's just the way they lived. So for that time, for that place, this is the hikmah. That was the best befitting way of dealing with things. Imam Abu Hanifa, on the other hand, he lived in, where? Kufa, remember? And that time, it was a very research-based place, a very debating-like culture. So it was very befitting for that place to conduct his majalis, his sittings of fiqh, his gatherings of fiqh, in that way. Okay? And that is just a touch, scratching the surface of on how they work their usul. We're going to stop here because the adhan is going to, somebody's going to call the adhan now, inshaAllah. And we'll conclude after Isha, inshaAllah. Those of you who are with us before the prayer, we started at 7 o'clock. Second in line in our series of the four Imams is Imam Malik. We previously, last month, discussed Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. And now we're discussing Malik ibn Anas rahimahullah. And the following month we're going to discuss Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah. This is the same Imam Malik who was born 93 after Hijri, and he passed away approximately 179 Hijri. He lived about 85 to 86 years. The historians are of difference of opinion, and that's totally fine, as normal. And he was known as the Imam of Medina, or the Imam of Dar al-Hijrah. This honorable tabi'i, Imam Malik ibn Anas, is a person who comes from a very, very golden fountain of knowledge. His riwayah in hadith, his chain of narration in hadith, is called the Silsilatul Dhahabiyah, the golden chain of narrations, meaning that he heard from Nafi', who was a tabi'i. And Nafi' heard from Abdullah ibn Umar. And Abdullah ibn Umar is the son of Umar radiallahu anhu, as he heard from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So Imam Malik, before we concluded, we were discussing his usul, or his principles, or his way of deducting rulings from the Sharia. And when we say the Sharia, we mean the Quran, the Sunnah, and the lives of the Sahaba. But the step before that is we were talking about how he would conduct himself in approach to this knowledge of the hadith and what? The fatwa or the fatawa, the opinions of the Sahaba. And he himself was one of those people, he was so careful. And they would say the amount of arrogance he would have would never show. Every human shows some type of arrogance or some type of pride. He got accustomed to saying this very, very popular phrase in the Arabic language is La adri. When people would come and ask him questions, if he wouldn't know, he would just say La adri, I don't know. That's what La adri means, I don't know. There was even an expedition that came to him from Egypt, and once an expedition came to him from Iraq. And the expedition that came to him from Egypt, they said to him, we have 30 questions, or I think it was 40 questions. We have 40 questions from the scholars of Egypt so that you can answer. And they went down the line. They kept on asking him. He said, La adri, La adri, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. He said, I don't know to 38 of the questions. And they said to him, what are the people of Egypt going to say? As said the expedition that came from Iraq. What are the people of Iraq going to say, of Baghdad going to say when we tell him the Imam of Medina doesn't know, and he only answered 2 questions out of the 40. And he said, tell them the Imam doesn't know. That's it. And one of the riwayats is pretty funny. They said that Imam Malik, he was very stern and he wanted to get the point across. So the people that came from Baghdad, they said, all these questions we asked and you said you don't know, what are you going to say? He said, you know what? Go get yourself a duff, hit it, and make a song saying that Imam Malik doesn't know. You can do that if you want. Meaning that he was letting them know that I'm a human being, I don't have to know. Just because I'm the mufti, just because I'm the scholar of, who's known to be a scholar of Medina, it doesn't mean I have to know everything. That's the domain of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not my domain. I'm a human being. Also his way of not taking things lightly. He was mentioning something in one of his classes, and one of his students, he said, oh, it's okay, this is a light matter. And Imam Malik looked at him and his face became red. And he said, there's no such thing as a light matter in this deen when we're talking about halal and haram. Don't you know the ayah? And he says to his student, إِنَّا سَنُلْقِي عَلَيْكَ قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا in Surah Muzammil. He said that this ayah in Surah Muzammil, where Allah says to Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, we're going to put upon you a responsibility, a saying, which is the Quran. And it's very, very heavy. So there's no such thing as a light matter, he told his student. Now, when we get into hadith, there's some things that have to be explained before we get into his life of hadith, his study of hadith. Why were the ulama, why was Imam Bukhari, because we know a lot about Imam Bukhari, why were they so careful when they would narrate hadith or hear hadith from somebody? Where did this culture start from? Just to let you know, Imam Malik, when he wrote his book Al-Muwatta, this was the first book of hadith that was written in chapters and organized in a way. And this was written before the Sahih al-Bukhari. So Imam Malik, being the Imam of Medina, why was he so strict, if you want to call it, in a positive way? Why was he so adamant on these principles that he had? It's because after the passing of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at the time of Uthman to be exact, there was a fitna, there was a period where people who had a sickness in their heart would make up hadith. Because if you were to say Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said this and you're living at the time of Ali or Uthman, or the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, or the time of Abu Bakr, you would believe it right away and you'd run to it. So at this time, At the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, we're talking, people would say, for instance, in the marketplace, they'd be selling a product and they said, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said about this that it cures all ailments, especially back pain, for instance, because there's a report where somebody said that. And this started to become prevalent at a time. So people would be selling things and getting their point across by saying Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said this, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that. So people started writing these things down, and they were what we call fabricated hadith, and they used to spread these. So at the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, he came across somebody that said Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said this and this and this. I can't remember what the hadith was. There's multiple instances. And another time, someone from the Tabi'een or a Sahabi came to Uthman and he said, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said this and this and this. And he said, where did you hear this from? Uthman is asking this person. He said, from this other person that's over there. He said, go grab him, go bring him here. And Uthman said, are you the one who said that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said this and this and this? He said, yes. Then he said, Sammu lana rijalakum. This is a very, very strong statement, and this is the statement that started the study of hadith. He said, name us your men. You claim that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said this, name us your men, rijalakum. Remember this statement. If you don't know it in Arabic, memorize it in English. Sammu lana rijalakum. Name us your men. Why did he say name us your men? And why didn't he say, what's the hadith? And try to debate the validity of the hadith. Is because a muhaddith, somebody who's a scholar in hadith, he's not a scholar in the text of the hadith. He's a scholar in all the men who are in the chain of narrations that narrated the hadith. Now, a part of the package deal of knowing the biographies of these people who are in the chain of narration, you come across many hadiths, so you end up memorizing lots of hadith. But a muhaddith is not somebody who memorizes the text of hadith. For instance, Muhammad said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. That's a hadith, right? A muhaddith is not a specialist in that, in the text of the hadith. He's a specialist in the transmitters and in the narrators of the hadith. Okay? So this science emanated from the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, where it became a rampant science, where it became a study. So the people who came after Uthman, naturally, the people who were hadith scholars like Imam Malik was a muhaddith, and he was a Amir al-Mu'mineen al-Hadith. So he was very strict on taking this hadith from people and their individual selves, how they were. There's many conditions. Not only for people who fabricated, but for people actually who had some type of weak memory, for instance. Somebody who was known in the chain of narrations, who had a weak memory, he was known by people to have a weak memory, that hadith would kind of be put to the side temporarily, and they would look for other hadith. This is what the study of ilm al-rijal is called now, what we call it now, is the study of men. There's multiple books like Sir al-Alam al-Nubala, which are 17 volumes, 20 volumes, which are just biographies of men who are in the chain of narration of hadith, the transmitters of hadith. Imam al-Dhahabi, you guys probably heard of, Imam ibn Kathir, they were the ones who used to compile the biographies of these people. So all you would see is the biography of these people. He was born over here. This is how many people he met. This is the people that he heard hadith from. He lived from this time to this time. But he was known to be forgetful. He was known to maybe cheat people at times. He was known not to be a good businessman. So those kind of hadith would be put to the side, and it would affect the strength of this hadith. So Imam Malik, when we come to him, he was a muhaddith. He was a tabi'i. He was somebody who collected hadith. He was somebody who compiled hadith. Okay? And we hear many times that Imam Malik or Imam Bukhari, after the kitab of Allah, the Quran, the most sahih book is Al-Bukhari, right? How many of us heard that? We've heard that, right? There's also many ulama. One of them is Shah Waliullah Dahlawi and other ulama from Hind and Pakistan and from Egypt and from Syria that said that no, after the Kitabullah is the Muwatta Imam Malik. So there's a difference of opinion amongst, it's not a big difference of opinion, but the majority of the ummah is of that Bukhari is the strongest after the Quran. But there's a decent portion of specialists that say that the Muwatta of Imam Malik is the strongest after the Quran, meaning it's the most reliable source of Sharia after the Quran. So he had conditions, and amongst those 4 conditions was, and some of them are very general, he said that I don't take ilm, I don't take knowledge from anybody who is known to be somewhat foolish or immature in a way, and wouldn't take the matters of deen, or people that would take the matters of deen lightly. And the second one is he said, I won't take ilm, I won't take knowledge from those people who involve themselves in hearsay and calling others towards innovation in the deen. Because amongst the ulama of hadith, there's a difference of opinion if you take hadith from somebody who's known to be an innovator. That if you were to study the history of this person A for instance, and he was known to be an innovator, somebody who was indulged in bid'ah, would you take hadith from him or not? So the difference of opinion amongst the muhaddithin, the scholars of hadith, they said that first we have to find what he would innovate in. And if the hadith that he was to narrate involved that type of innovation, we would not take those certain hadith from him. But Imam Malik was very strict on that. He said, no, if he had an ounce of innovation inside of him, there's no transmission for him. We're not taking any hadith from him, to being careful of the sayings and the doings and the acceptance of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The third condition would be a person who would lie or exaggerate in conversation. When we say lie, we don't talk about blatant lies, because there's a type of lying that even in joking that we have to be careful. All of us are guilty of this. That as a joke, you would say, oh, I got in a car accident. No, I'm just joking. That is considered a lie in Islam. That's not considered joking. Joking in Islam is humor, not telling a lie. So this kind of humor would be considered a lie in Islam, and Imam Malik would completely not take hadith from any person, even if he narrated 1,000 hadith. If somebody was known to lie in his joking, he would take hadith from him. And he said the fourth one is a person who is a pious worshipper or a scholar, but does not correctly memorize his narrations. So he was saying that this person can be the religious of people. He can be a scholar in your eyes, but if he makes mistakes in his memorization or makes mistakes in his narration, this is something we can't tolerate, even though he may be a good human being. But when it comes to the priority of preserving the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have to be extra careful. So we have to have some type of conditions that are somewhat superhuman. Like Imam Bukhari, for instance, when he went to somebody in Yemen who was known to be a narrator of hadith, and he went there just for one hadith, to collect this one hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he found this person trying to feed his horse, and his horse was a stubborn horse. It wasn't eating, or it wasn't drinking water, I'm sorry. So what he would do is he would take the food and lead the horse to the water. So Imam Bukhari, he saw this and he said, if this is a person that's narrating hadith, he may be a good person. He's doing something that's from a natural tendency. But this tendency that I see in him, fooling the horse, even though he's allowed to, there's nothing un-Islamic about this. But this tendency of him fooling the horse with food, entrapping it to go drink some water, I'm not taking hadith from him, even though it's completely allowed. But there's a small tendency in him of deception, which is not haram originally. That's the point I want to get across to everybody. That's why I'm repeating that. There's nothing haram with what he was doing. And there's nothing haram with the people that he didn't take hadith from. But when it comes to the preservation of the hadith, you have to have somewhat superhuman tendencies of taking these hadith. Because Allah already made the promise in the Quran that He's going to preserve the Quran until Yawm al-Qiyamah. But when it comes to the hadith and Nabawi, who are the preservers? It's men like you and I, right? So we have to make some type of conditions that are almost impossible to meet. And only the elite amongst them can bring these hadith about to us and transmit these hadith. And it's all for the sake of being very careful. So Imam Malik was once asked about one of the tabi'een, one of the people who were a generation after the Sahaba, named Amr bin Dinar. Look at this intricacy. He says, one of his students came to him and said, Amr ibn Dinar is a very pious person and he narrates hadith. How come you never take any hadith from him? He said, I was inclined once to take hadith from him because I saw his depth and his zeal and his accuracy. But once I saw him narrating hadith in a standing position. I saw him narrating hadith in a standing position. And I felt this was disrespectful to the hadith, of narrating the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I no longer took hadith from him, and that thought of my mind was eliminated of taking hadith from him, and it was almost like I took a burden off myself. There's less people I have to worry about from taking hadith from. He said, even though his hadith may be completely right, but as far as my way of doing it, as far as my curriculum, I'm not going to accept hadith from him. Because he was narrating hadith in a standing position. This tells us something about Imam Malik. Imam Malik was of the opinion that if you are listening to a majlis where hadith is being mentioned and you're walking by, you have to come and sit out of the respect of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you're transmitting a hadith, not just telling somebody a hadith, like if I was to tell you guys a hadith, like innamal a'malu binniyat, but if you were narrating a hadith that you said, I heard from my teacher, who heard from the Sahabi, who heard from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if you are the people who are narrating the hadith, you have to be in a sitting position out of respect for Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you're in a standing position, I'm not taking any hadith from you. This is what led Imam Malik, these conditions that led him to being the Imam of the Dar al-Hijrah, which is Medina, is because he was very strict in taking these hadith. Now imagine somebody in his personality, the personality that we mentioned about him, that he was so strict in even hypothetical discussions, as different to the Hanafis. The Hanafis were very much based on, after they got to base in core understandings of the deen, they would jump and they would take pride in hypothetical discussions about fiqh. Like if somebody went on the moon, what direction would they pray in, right? Imam Malik was completely against this. His philosophy was, and we're not saying he's wrong, none of them are wrong. Every single one of them is needed for every single time. If there was only one madhab in the ummah, that would put all the people in an awkward situation. Because somebody who grows up and lives in a desert, right? And somebody who grows up living around the Sears Tower or the Willis Towers and works on the 90th floor or whatever you want to call it, do you think that person who grew up living in a desert in a tent, his outlook on life is going to be the same as a person who grew up on the Sears Tower or ends up living in that area? No, it's impossible. That's not the way we are. So even the Sahaba, from the areas that they went, they would change their opinions in fiqh according to the environment that they were in. Not changing core beliefs in Islam, but small things. And we're going to get to that, inshallah. So Imam Malik, living in Medina, living in a desert, he was very much stuck on people that want to be hypothetical, they can be hypothetical. We are not going to be hypothetical, number one, because if you get hypothetical, and he has a point here, you can stray away from the original sources of the Quran and the Sunnah, and some type of human tendencies can enter inside of the philosophy of Islam, the true philosophy of Islam, which is the Quran and the Sunnah, right? We're all on the same page here, right? So he said, in preservation, we're not going to go anywhere outside of the boundaries of the Quran and the Sunnah and the lives of the Sahaba that absorbed directly from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that itself was something for his environment, and that's what led to calling the people of Medina the Ahlul Hadith. Meaning they were the people who were very stuck on the hadith. I'm not saying in a negative connotation, it's actually a very positive connotation. Okay? They were the people who were the Ahl of Hadith, the people of Hadith, and they would refrain from straying from the topics of the Hadith in respect of Medina and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's that same respect that emanated from Imam Malik, that Imam Shafi'i was his student. And he said, I went to his house one time and I saw two beautiful horses and some mules in front of his house. And every time I went by his house, they would be in the same place. They would never move. And he would never ride a horse. So Imam Shafi'i, he asked his teacher, Imam Malik, he says, how come you never use these beautiful horses, these stallions that are just ready to use? And Imam Malik says, how dare I ride on a horse whose hooves touch the ground of Medina, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is buried in this Medina. So he never rode his horses, and he said, these are for you, I don't want these, to Imam Shafi'i. He said, no, I was just asking a question. I said, no, you have to accept, I don't want these, I never ride them anyway. It's that same respect that Imam Malik had, that around Masjid Nabawi, and some narrations say in Medina, he wouldn't wear his shoes or his slippers in fear of stepping where Muhammad ﷺ stepped. This is the qualities that I'm talking about, these superhuman qualities. Doesn't mean he's superhuman, but he has some tendencies of what we consider superhuman to preserve this religion and preserve these hadith. Do you think somebody who has this personality can cheat anybody on the land of Medina? Do you think anybody with these type of traits and these characteristics and these tendencies can exaggerate or make up something about a hadith? He doesn't want to walk with his slippers in Medina in fear of stepping where Muhammad ﷺ stepped. Well, what do you think he's going to say about the hadith? That's why that tendency was there for calling him the hadith, or he, out of respect, wanted to stick only to the hadith and not be hypothetical. Which is why they have a tendency of, we call, and I don't mean this in a negative way, that they had some zahiriyya tendencies inside of them. Meaning, they would take everything from face value and resort to that, of taking hadith from the face value out of respect for the hadith. And like we mentioned before, the Imams of Baghdad and Kufa, they were known as Ahl al-Ra'i, meaning the people of opinion, people of being hypothetical and delving in things deeply. Looking for things that were on, underneath the surface of the hadith. And that's what the Hanafis were known for. And when he would narrate hadith, he would try not to move at all. What do I mean by that? Is that Abdullah ibn Mubarak, who is another tabi'i, reports that one time Imam Malik was bitten by a scorpion under his garment 10 times on his back while narrating hadith. And during the narration of hadith, he did not stop in order to remove it. Rather, he continued to narrate until the end. I noticed discoloration in his face. Abdullah ibn Mubarak is saying this. I noticed his face discolored. And when the Imam was being bitten, he noticed while the hadith was being said that his face was being discolored, but he was kind of fidgeting a little bit, and he continued reading the hadith. And afterwards, all the people left. I came to the Imam and asked him, what happened? I saw your face being discolored. I saw you fidgeting. I saw you stopping for a second, squinting. I saw you being very uncomfortable. What was it that you were talking about? What was it that caused you to do that? He said, after the dars, I looked at my back, and there was a scorpion stuck inside of my clothing, under my garment. And for that reason, I wasn't moving, and I knew something very painful was happening to me, but that's what the result was. That's what it was. And he said, even for a scorpion, you didn't move your back? He said, no, how can I if I'm saying the sayings of Muhammad ﷺ in his masjid, being in Medina, in his land, living in the place of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was a Sahabi, how dare I move for the sake of a scorpion? So, any of you who know what a scorpion is or what a snake is, you'll know how extremely painful that is. And it was said that he was bit 10 times by the scorpion while narrating this one hadith. As far as a man of principles, he was a man of principles. Some said that when it came to narrating hadith or ilm, he was very specific, like we mentioned. But his face and his complexion would change if he was in doubt that people were saying something that wasn't right, for the sake of the hadith of sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And his majlis of ilm, get this, his majlis of ilm contained many, many people who were prominent scholars. So, the Khalifa at that time, Harun al-Rashid, he writes a letter to Imam Malik. And he says that I have 2 sons, Ma'mun, and I can't remember the other one. And he says, my 2 sons want to learn hadith from you. So I need to organize something for you to come to my house and teach them hadith. What do you think Imam Malik's response was? He writes a letter back saying that this honorable thing I teach of Muhammad doesn't come to homes, you have to come to it. So he said, you send your kids to me. And he's talking to Amir al-Mu'minin at the time. How many of you have heard of Harun al-Rashid? Harun al-Rashid. He's talking to the Khalifa of the Muslims. So next, Harun al-Rashid is not very happy with this reply. So he says, okay, fine. In the next letter, can I have my 2 sons? Can you have a dars? They come to you, but just in your own home or just strictly for them? He writes a hadith. He writes a letter back to Harun al-Rashid saying that this is the study of the sayings of Muhammad and the doings and the acceptance and his shama'il, meaning the way he looks and how he behaved. So we're not going to have favors in this because everyone in the sight of Allah is equal. Just because your kids are from the ruling class, it doesn't give them any privileges when it comes to Muhammad because we're talking about Muhammad. So you bring your kids and they're going to be with everybody else. They're not going to be given any favors. So then he personally comes to Imam Malik and he said, I appreciate this. You actually put me in line. This is the Amir al-Mu'minin talking to Imam Malik. And many other, because the time of Imam Malik, he lived between the transition of the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasi dynasty. Okay, the Umayyad dynasty came first of the Khulafa and the Khulafa al-Abbasiyah. And from the Khulafa al-Abbasiyah was Mansur. His name was Mansur. And he offered Imam Malik money of 3,000 dirhams or dinars. And he says, and Imam Malik was of this understanding of the ulama. He said that the ulama, or the people who are in charge of other people, they are the only people who don't accept gifts from the rulers. Everybody else, they can if they want. But the ulama, the people who have ilm and teach, qala Allah, who teach what Allah said, and qala Rasulullah, they accept no gifts from the ruling party. So he said, I have to refuse what you're giving. He said, no, it's a gift, you have to accept. He said, yes, but this can start swaying, because he didn't want to be involved in the swaying of his rules, of what he extrapolated from the Quran and Sunnah, and he didn't want to favor the ruling party, because this occurred. This is the reason why he went to jail. Do you guys remember? Imam Hanifa. This is one of the reasons why he went to jail, is because the ruling party at that time had a hidden agenda, and they wanted him to rule accordingly, and he said, no, I'm not going to, and he went to jail for that. This is the same thing that happened to Imam Malik. Just on a tangent. This wasn't a part of the dars, but just on a tangent. Just to let you realize what the true ulama were like. So, one of the people from the ruling party, it might be from the Umayyad period, I may be wrong, but it's someone from the ruling party. They said to him that this is a transition. No, it wasn't the Abbasi period. It was a transition of the Umayyad period to the Abbasi period. So the Abbasi dynasty, they said that you have to support us in this overtaking of the ruling party, of the Khilafah. Okay? There was some tension that happened. Okay? It's unfortunate, but it occurs. We're human beings. We tend to stray from the path, and we learn from our lessons. We learn lessons from these. So, he was of the opinion, Imam Malik originally, that if a man divorces his wife through ikrah, what does ikrah mean? Meaning, for instance, somebody holds a gun to your head and says that he says to you, divorce your wife. He said, I will, because I'm going to die. According to Imam Malik, that's not a real divorce. According to the other imams, it was a real divorce. It occurs with it. That's taken from the hadith of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, "Rufi'a al-bani Adam al-khata' wal-nisyan." Al-khata' wal-nisyan, meaning that the pens are not writing, meaning that insan is not held accountable for making mistakes. Al-khata' wal-nisyan. وَمَا اسْتُكْرِهُ عَلَيْهِ, and what they're forced to do. Al-ikrah. So if somebody is forced to drink alcohol, for instance, and he drinks, then obviously he's not liable, right? According to the hadith. This is what Imam Malik was saying. So the people of Abbas, the Abbasi period, they were saying, make the people, and they were making the people accept the ruling. And Imam Malik was saying, that this is not a real ruling because you're forcing people to do it. Do you guys see where that deduction came from? They're forcing people to do it. So he said, I can't make people do what you're forcing them to do. So he was put in jail for that. And he was given 70 lashes, I think, for that, until they felt guilty. They said, what are we doing to this Imam? And even to the point where they embarrassed him. Because when people think that they're convinced on something, they become very hard-headed, right? So Imam Malik, and this is very, very sad, and this is one of the reasons why he was one of my favorite Imams, or is my favorite Imam amongst the four, is that they put him in such an embarrassing situation that he didn't do what they told him to do, that they put him on a donkey in the middle of the Medina, in the middle of Medina, and tied his hands and made the donkey run in front of all the people. Imagine somebody disrespectful, somebody this high in the eyes of the tabi'een was succumbed to do this and was forced to do this because of a religious understanding or a principle that he had. So he never let his principles shift, even if it was a fiqhi mas'ala, even if it was something that had to do with fiqh. And telling the Khalifa Abu Ja'far al-Mansur that we were talking about, as far as his principles, a lot of the khulafa, you have to understand, like Harun al-Rashid, they loved the ulama. A lot of them, they depended on the ulama. But sometimes, if they needed something to get done, it's almost like a natural human tendency to say, okay, this is a very influential person who's an alim, who is the Imam of Medina. Let's convince him so he can convince everybody else, right? So Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who was one of the khulafa at the time, he happened to be sitting in the majlis of Imam Malik, and he was mentioning a hadith and he was raising his voice. So Imam Malik reprimanded him. And he said, you may be whoever you are, but when you're mentioning the sayings of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, talk with respect. Know who you are. Just because you're the ruler, it doesn't mean you can play or act however you want with the sayings of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So imagine these principles. It is this very man who preserved this madhab of the Maliki madhab, obviously, which is based on what he deduced from the Quran and the Sunnah. Now getting in directly into his usul. Now we discuss his principles and how he would conduct his classes. Now what was his usul? What was his ways of extrapolating from the Quran and the Sunnah? Because you have to understand, everybody, as far as the Imams, even though they may say something that doesn't seem like it's directly from the Quran and the Sunnah, they have deduced and extrapolated from the Quran and the Sunnah. So, if someone was to say that the ayah of Tahara is what we mentioned last time, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtum ila salati, right? O you who believe, when you stand up to do your prayer, right? Now, something has to be stopped over here. And I'm just giving this as an example. You have to stop over here. Someone who's a jurist, someone who is a mufti, someone who is an alim, someone who is an imam, he has to stop and say, إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, when you stand up for prayer. He stops over there in that very detail. And he says, okay, now Allah says in the Quran, when you stand up for prayer. Does that in a literal sense mean that when you stand up for prayer, or you're getting ready for prayer? Does qumtum, meaning the action of standing over here, mean anytime you're sitting, for instance, somebody here is sitting, and he finished praying, and he wants to pray again. When he stands up, does he have to do wudu again, or no? But that's something he has to think about. That's what usul is. He has to think about that, and he has to come to a conclusion of what qumtum, what standing over here means. So when he talks about standing over here in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal, he's talking about when you prepare for iqamat as-salah, and if you don't have wudu, then you have to do wudu. That's what it's talking about. And the ayah goes on, فَغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ, wash your faces and wash your hands up to your elbows, إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ. And then there's a wow that occurs. This is the last example inside here. Okay? يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ, and wash your hands to your elbows. وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. Okay? And do masah on your head. وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ. Okay? وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ. So in between all of these, there's a wow that's occurring. أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وأمسحوا برؤوسكم and wipe your. So Allah is constantly saying and. When you wash your face, and wash your hands to your elbows, and wipe your hair, and wash your feet. So this and that's occurring here in the Arabic language is wow. Now according to Imam Abu Hanifa, it's still a valid wudu if you go out of order. You're not supposed to, but if you do, and that's what the Hanafis are known for. They're pushing the limits to make everybody comfortable so they can understand what the limits are. And that's also in usul al-fiqh, okay? Am I confusing anybody? Is there any more explanation that needs to be done before I proceed? Okay. So what happens is, this is usul al-fiqh. What is this wow? So according to Imam Hanifa, is that it's okay, it's not good, it's not preferred, and you shouldn't make a habit of it. But if you go out of order of doing wudu, it's okay. It's an accepted wudu. You have a valid wudu and you can pray with it. You can touch the Quran and everything. Okay? And that's because this wow, he called this wow, the wow al-jama'ah or wow al-tajmiyah. Meaning that this wow that's occurring over here, which means and, it basically means as long as you do all of these that are in the Quran that tells you to do, of how to perform wudu, you're fine. It's a valid wudu. But you should try to go with the order of the Quran. Okay? According to Imam Shafi'i, this wow in the Arabic language is wow with tartib, which means this wow comes for tartib, meaning for a specific order. It's a linguistic thing. So their difference of opinion is over language. You have to understand that. This is what usul al-fiqh is. So according to Imam Shafi'i, he said that this wow that occurs, you have to go in that order. You wash your face, there's a wow that comes, wa. Wash your hands to your elbows, wa, meaning and, wash, give masah to your forehead or your head, and wa, wash your feet. Okay? That is usul al-fiqh. That is how they deduce rulings. So the rulings in this ayah that has to do with tahara and wudu, the usul or the principles of this is deduced through a linguistic means. So the person who is an usuli, the person who is involved in usul al-fiqh, he has to be a master of Arabic language. Because when it comes to this, he has to go through all the bounds of the ayat of tahara. And that's just the ayat of tahara. Imagine all the different rules and regulations we have to do. That they have to deduce from. Now you understand the magnitude and how hard this work is. Is that not only does he have to be a master of Arabic language, not only does he have to be a master of the sayings of the Sahaba and the sayings of Muhammad and a full grasp of the Quran. Right? And there's different tools of understanding this, and all the Imams had a slightly different way of doing this, and that's what we're going to go through now of Imam Malik. Okay? So all of them, the major source was the Quran, right? The reason why the Quran was revealed was not only to give us hidayah, but let us know how to do our daily affairs as far as rules and regulations, and the how-tos and the ibadah. So the number one source, according to Imam Malik and all the other Imams, was the Quran. Okay? Quran source number one. And as far as Imam Malik is concerned, this happened with a lot of the Imams, is that at their time, they never really wrote their usul, meaning their way of extrapolating rules and regulations from the Quran and the Sunnah. They never really wrote it down. Their students would write everything down and they would make books on it. So they didn't say, okay, this is article number one, this is how we're going to do it. No, that was the job of the students. Okay? So number one was the Quran. Number two was the Sunnah. Okay? Obviously, the Sunnah is a very, very broad understanding. Okay? Just on a mini tangent over here, just so we understand what Sunnah means, because sometimes there's a misunderstanding amongst people of what the Sunnah is. Okay? The Sunnah, in a linguistic means, is kind of like, it's synonymous with sirah, meaning the way someone would do something. Okay? So according to the ulama of hadith, the muhaddithin, the sunnah is ما صدر عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من قول أو فعل أو تقرير أو صفة خلقين أو خلقين. Okay, so they would say that according to the muhaddithin, the ulama of hadith, a sunnah means that everything Muhammad صلى الله عليه وسلم did or said, did, accepted, meaning a sahabi would do something and he would stay silent. You know how we say silence is acceptance? That's basically what it is. Taqreerin, أو صفة, or a certain characteristic of his. Whether it be good manners or the way he looked. Meaning the way his for instance, his cheekbones were, the way his hair was, the color of his hair, the way his build. That's according to the ulama of hadith what sunnah means. Sunnah, according to the fuqaha, is something completely different. Sunnah, according to the jurists, is something completely different. Sunnah, according to the people of seerah, is completely different. Sunnah, according to the people of tafsir, is completely different. So when someone does something halal and haram, we're not looking for the sunnah according to the muhaddithin that we just mentioned. The sunnah according to the fuqaha, the people of fiqh, the jurists, they have to do the rules and regulations. Halal and haram is with the simple meaning that it's good if you do it because Muhammad did it, so you get ajr for doing it. If you leave it, there's no haram in doing so. Are we clear on that? So all the different fields in Islam have their own understanding of what the word sunnah means. So somebody says, oh, it's sunnah, I saw it in a hadith. Sunnah according to whom is the first question you have to ask. Is it sunnah not only according, when I say according to whom, I don't mean which imam. I'm saying to which specialty. Meaning, the ulama of hadith, is it sunnah? Is it sunnah according to the fuqaha? Who is it sunnah according to? Okay? So the dressing, for instance, the way Muhammad used to dress, for instance, according to the muhaddithin, yes, it's sunnah. Meaning everything that he did, everything that he said, everything that he wore is sunnah according to the muhaddithin. Everything that he did, so for instance, there's a notion now and it causes disunity and it shouldn't amongst the ummah of that Muhammad for instance, he used to wear a turban or he used to wear a qalansuwa. This is a qalansuwa. Classically, they used to call what we call in Urdu a topi or a kufi. This is what they would call a qalansuwa. Okay? A qalansuwa is basically a head coat. Okay? So if somebody comes and says to us that it's sunnah to wear a turban or a qalansuwa, what's the first question we have to ask ourselves? Is it a sunnah according to the muhaddithin? Or is it the type of sunnah that if I do it, I get ajr, and if I leave it, there's nothing upon me? Are we clear here? Do you understand it? So if somebody says it's sunnah, they have to have a very valid reason. Yes, it is sunnah according to the muhaddithin. It's sunnah according to the muhaddithin. Meaning that Muhammad yes, he used to wear a turban. And obviously there's no comparison. But this is an understanding of the hadith and the fuqaha that Muhammad used to wear what his people used to wear so they wouldn't alienate him. Who else used to wear a turban at the time? Everybody. Whether you were Muslim or not Muslim. Everybody, it was a custom of that time, they used to wear a turban. Right? So you have to differentiate. And this is usul again, usul al-fiqh. When Muhammad did something, is it adah or is it ibadah? Was it adah of the people and he did it for the adah so people wouldn't alienate him and he would be just like them so they would have no reason not to accept what he was doing? Or was it in ibadah for him wearing a turban? And it wasn't the latter. It wasn't for him doing it for the sake of ibadah. It was for the sake of adah. So if there's no way anyone can be reprimanded or have the right or feel to reprimand somebody else if they're not wearing a turban, if you're a male, if you're wearing a turban in any way. Because according to the sunnah, it's sunnah of the muhaddithin, not of the fuqaha. If it was sunnah according to the fuqaha to cover your head for a man or wear a turban, then you could look down upon that person or you could say, I'm not praying behind that person for whatever reason, but that's not the case over here. Because according to the fuqaha, it's not a sunnah to cover your head if you're a man. I just wanted to make that clear because there's a lot of disunity that happens amongst the ummah for that reason. So you're not even able to have the tendency and capability of looking down upon somebody for not wearing a turban or wearing a qalansuwa or a turban. Cool? And that's something that has to be usul also. And that's something that the ulama had depth in to come to that conclusion, inshallah. So the sunnah is something that Imam Malik was using as a second source for deducing what was from the Sharia. Okay? Whether it be what he did or what he encouraged and everything. Okay? So it was very general. But when he would say something is sunnah, that was very something specific. Because sunnah, you can call hadith, is basically synonymous for hadith, right? If I could say there's 6 books of the sunnah, I mean there's 6 books of hadith, right? But if I was to say the ruling on this is sunnah, that's a whole different thing, okay? So according to the sunnah, this is a very general understanding of the sunnah, which means he deduced everything from the sayings and the doings of Muhammad ﷺ and what Muhammad ﷺ encouraged, okay? Number 3 thing in line, and this is very interesting. Those of you who were here last month, you will remember that we were talking about the methodology of Imam Abu Hanifa. But Imam Malik, his 3rd in line was the amal of Ahl Medina. Because he lived in Medina, right? So it was a valid source of Sharia for him to follow what the people of Medina were doing. There were multiple hadith that reached him. There were multiple hadith that reached him, but he didn't do it because he didn't see the people of Medina doing it. Okay, for instance, the raf'a yadayn in salah, when you raise your hands in between the ruku and before going into ruku and coming back from ruku and coming out from the second rak'ah, according to a portion of the ulama like Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, the only raf'a yadayn that you're doing is when you open your prayer, the takbir al-tahrim. Okay, according to the rest, it's in between almost all the actions. Okay, but why did Imam Malik not practice that? He said, بَلَغَتْنِي أَحَادِيث رَفْعِ الْيَدَيْنِ. The hadith came to me of رَفْعِ الْيَدَيْنِ, but I didn't see the people of Medina doing it, so I didn't do it. You understand how this works in deducing, extrapolating rules and regulations. He said that all the hadith reached me, but when I was in Medina, I saw nobody doing it, so I refrained from doing it. And I encouraged people to do what the people of Medina were doing. So 3rd in line after the Quran and Sunnah was the amal of Ahl Medina. And he said that this is a hujjah for me after the Quran and Sunnah. This is a very strong evidence for me as Sharia, is because this is where Muhammad ﷺ passed away. This is where the Sahaba passed away. And it only makes sense if everyone else is doing it, they're only one generation away from the Sahaba, I have to do it too. And everybody living in Medina should do it also. And he preferred this over the hadith of Khabar Ahad. Who remembers when we were talking about Khabar Ahad last month? Okay, let me explain that briefly. Khabar Ahad is basically the chain of narration in hadith that comes from either one person down, meaning that, let me make it a little more easy. There's a car accident that happens in front of all of us, right? Let's say 10 people saw it, right? That's scenario number 1. Let's say a car accident happens and only one person sees it. Or 2 people, or 3 people see that car accident, right? So those 3 people come and say, as witnesses, we saw this car accident occur. Right? That's the same thing with Khabar Ahad. Khabar Ahad is a chain of narration that came down, basically, from a Sahaba saying something, or 3 Sahaba hearing from another Sahabi, or a Tabi'i, a person after a generation of the Sahaba. One person hears, one Tabi'i hears, and he tells one other person. And they tell one other person, it keeps on going down, or just one person in the middle hears from one person. For instance, a Sahabi says something to a Tabi'i, one Tabi'i, okay? And that one Tabi'i goes and tells everybody else. That's considered Khabar Ahad, meaning the hadith that came down was transmitted from one person in the chain of narration. The opposite, or 2 or 3, that's still called Khabar Ahad. The one that's opposite to that is Khabar Mutawatir, in which the Quran came down to us. Which means 1,000 Sahaba narrated to 1,000 Sahaba, these ayat of the Quran narrated to over 1,000 and it went on like that. And there's some hadith, very few hadith, which are called a hadith al-mutawatir. And those type of hadith, which means that there's no doubt that this occurred, that it came down from 1,000 to 1,000, or a big bunch to a big bunch. Okay? Now, according to Imam Malik, if a hadith, Khabar Ahad, came to him, but he saw the people of Medina doing something else, he would follow Ahl Medina of what they were doing. He would still use his hadith, but it wouldn't be at the same strength. Are we clear? According to Imam Abu Hanifa, he said that if Khabar Ahad comes to me, I would prefer doing ijtihad. Because the era that he was living in, there were many fabricators of hadith, and he would want to remove all doubt. So he said, if there's a hadith and Khabar Ahad comes to me, I'm going to choose to do ijtihad instead of using the Khabar Ahad hadith. Okay? So Imam Malik's philosophy of taking the actions of the people of Medina was that al-alf. Wal-alf, actually the exact wording is alfun and alfun khayrun min wahidan wahid. He said, 1,000, narrating from 1,000 is dearer to me than one narrating from one. So if there was a hadith that was at the level of Khabar Ahad, he would accept the amal of Ahl Medina because there were thousands. And he would accept that, and he would take that as a hujjah. The next in line is that the fatwa of a sahabi, that if he wouldn't find something in the Quran, if he wouldn't find something in the Sunnah, if he wouldn't find something of the amal of Ahl Medina, he would look for the fatwa of the Sahaba. And this manhaj, this way of doing things, this method is taken by what? This method is taken by the very saying of Muhammad when he sent Mu'adh bin Jabal to Yemen. And he said, Mu'adh bin Jabal to be basically a judge in Yemen and rule the people by Islam as an ambassador of Muhammad. So he said, before he left, when he was on his journey, he said, what are you going to rule by? He said, by the book of Allah. They said, ثُمَّ مَاذَا? And then what? Oh, he said, فَإِن لَمْ تَجِدْ. If you don't find it in there, he said, بِسُنَّةِ نَبِيِّهِ, by the sunnah of his Nabi, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He said, then what if you don't? He said, if I don't find it in these, then I'm going to do my own ijtihad. Meaning that I'm going to try to deduce everything I can directly and indirectly from this Quran and the sunnah and pass my own opinion and verdict. So, the Sahaba, since this was a practice of them taught from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this was the same thing or the same concept of imams that the Muslims who are of the Sunni order follow as far as their fiqh is concerned. Is that they were looking for somebody who was very competent and proficient in the Quran, in the Sunnah, in the lives of the Sahaba, and they left them in charge to be their teachers. And that's what we call the imams. And like we mentioned before Isha, before the prayer today, that Imam Malik, before teaching, he got the ijazah and the recognition of 70 or 90 of the ulama, top ulama of his time, to teach the Quran and teach the Sunnah specifically. So after going through, if he didn't find a ruling, for instance, in the Quran, if he didn't find it in the Sunnah, and he didn't find it in the amal of the Ahl Medina, then he would go to the fatwa of the Sahaba. He would look for the fatwa or the sayings that Sahaba were specific for. And the Sahaba were known to give fatwas. Aisha radiallahu anha was known to give fatwas. She was known as a mufti. She was a female, but she was a mufti. She was known, even her students from the Tabi'een wrote down all of her fatwa in the book that's still published, that you can still find parts of it in publishing houses. That the fatwa that were specifically for Aisha radiallahu anha. Right? And she was so brave, she would differ with some of the Sahaba. She would differ with Umar. She actually told Umar, she said, Ittaqillah ya Umar, she said, fear Allah ya Umar, when she had a difference of opinion with him. Obviously they still had that love for the sake of Allah, but they were, when it came to the matters of Qala Allah, what Allah said and what Rasulullah said, they were very strong on their position and they would debate that position very thoroughly. So fatwa of the Sahaba was next for him in line. The next one in line for him was al-Qiyas. And we mentioned Qiyas when we were talking about Imam Abu Hanifa, is we translate it as analogy. And a very simple way of looking at it is this, is that alcohol is haram, right? And the thing that makes alcohol haram, or one of the main things that makes it haram, not only that the reason that Allah made it haram, but it intoxicates you and it changes your mind from the regular state of being a human being to something else. Okay? Now that was at that time. Let's say we come to a time now. Okay, we have an issue here of marijuana, for instance. Or any type of heroin or cocaine or whatever that case may be. Now there's nothing directly in the Quran and Sunnah that mentioned marijuana, that mentioned cocaine. Has anybody ever seen the word cocaine in a hadith or in the Quran? We haven't seen it, right? So now we have to look at this, and this is the job of the usuli. This is the job of a person who is very well grounded in fiqh. He has to look at this thing and see what are the qualities of these things. If this is one of those things that intoxicate the mind or alter the mind, change it from the original state of what it is in its natural state to something else, then it's at the level of alcohol. So that's what we call in Sharia, it's called qiyas, meaning analogy. That one thing was haram, and the underlying legal common cause of that thing was something, so something else becomes haram because it shares a common legal cause. Too complicated? Okay. The next one is called maslaha al-mursala, and it seemed to be that Imam Malik was specific for this, and he was the strongest and pushed this the most, and some of the ulama didn't really follow this by its same wording, al-maslaha al-mursala. It's basically, maslaha means what? Benefit, okay? And mursala is, when it's used in conjunction with maslaha, is basically which is beneficial for the general public, okay? Beneficial for the general public. That has to be something that's very clear. It's because one of the aims of Sharia, one of the maqasid of Sharia, is, one of the objections of Sharia is bringing benefit to people. Okay? For instance, is that if there's some type of spike or some type of glass in the path where people walk, right? It's the understanding of Islam to remove that, whoever sees it. It becomes fard, right? And if you see it, and you let it go, and you take it really light, it can become something that's haram. Okay? So the benefit that the Sharia offers is basically in golden lettering what the definition of Sharia is. That's what it wants. It wants to bring benefit. Okay? So according to Imam Malik, this al-maslaha wal-mursala was a part of the Sharia and something that he used. For instance, when it came to the taxing of people, which is called in Arabic the kharaj, the Sahaba issued that there will be taxes temporarily in order to raise funds for new places that they conquered, or the Muslims conquered, and the farmland needed lots of money and stuff to, for its estate. So the Sahaba issued that there's going to be something for the Muslims called kharaj, meaning the tax. Now, this is something from the face value of the Sharia that wasn't there for the Muslims to pay a tax, right? There was nothing in the Quran, there was nothing from the Sunnah, there was nothing from the Qiyas. But for the benefit of everybody else, and there was a need for something, they issued something that was based on what we call the ruh of the Sharia, meaning the spirit of the Sharia, which is benefit for the public. This is maslaha al-mursala. Another thing is that the Sahaba did is they issued a currency. And with currency, what do? You pay zakat, right? But this is nothing that was directly from the Sunnah or the Quran to issue a currency, but the Sahaba did it anyway. And this was an example that Imam Malik used as al-maslaha al-mursala. And some of the other Imams, like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and many other Imams, just on a side note, there's many other Imams who had their madhahib, who had their schools of thought, but they just didn't become as popular as the four. Okay? Like Layth ibn Sa'd. I'm saying that because he used to be a student of Imam Malik, and some of them said that he surpassed the level of Imam Malik, but his madhab was not preserved like Imam Malik's was preserved. Imam al-Layth is actually buried in Egypt, and he was a big scholar in Egypt of the Maliki madhab, and after he got to a level, he developed his own madhab. So there's multiple usulis or mujtahids that are out there, but their madhabs didn't last as long. Okay? So, according to these other Imams, they didn't use the same wording as maslaha wal mursala, meaning this general benefit for the public. He said that they called it something else, but everybody else uses the same thing. Okay? What that means is they didn't use the words maslaha wal mursala, but in their fatwas, in their verdicts, they would use it without calling it that. Okay? So that was the next thing that he used. The last and final one that he concluded to, which was very important, is called sadd al-dhara'i or sadd al-dhari'a. Sadd means, to have a blockage of something. Al-dhari'a, in Urdu we say zariya, right? The pathways to do something. Or wasila. It's synonymous with wasila, to do something. Sadd means to stop something. The dhara'i means wasila, the pathways in order to achieve something. But over here, in the study of usul, sadd al-dhara'i means blocking the means. It means blocking the means. Okay? For instance, according to Imam Malik, using the dalil of Sadd al-Dhari'ah, meaning not using the Quran, not using the Sunnah, not using the things of the people of Medina did, not using qiyas, but using the spirit of the Sharia of blocking the means which cause haram. According to him, he said, when it's a time of fitna, it's haram to sell artillery and weapons. Because in a time of fitna, if someone was to sell weapons, meaning if you're in a lawless era for a small period of time, and there's total chaos, those people who happen to sell weapons, or who happen to make swords, or happen to make bow and arrows, they have to stop making that right away. It's haram for them to sell after that. And all the money they make after that is haram, because there's a possibility they can be aiding the fitna, and it's easier for people to misuse those weapons, meaning killing people innocently. Cool? So this is something that he would use. It's called Sadd al-Dhari'ah. Meaning that it's originally from the Quran and Sunnah, this understanding of blocking means of harm. Okay? The other ways that the Sahaba, the Imams are talk about Sadd al-Dhari'ah, meaning blocking the means in usul al-fiqh, would be, they would come to the conclusion, for instance, that, okay, khalwa with a man and a woman is haram. Meaning for a man and a woman to be in a room closed alone is considered haram. This is an established thing. Now, what is the reason for that? They would delve deep inside that. They said the ruh of the Sharia, the spirit of the Sharia, is that there's something or a possibility that a haram may occur. Whether it be maybe not lowering your gaze, whether it be touching the opposite gender, and touching the opposite gender leading to zina or anything else. Okay? So that in the Sharia they call it Sadd al-Dhari'ah, that Allah made this thing haram, Sadd al-Dhara'i', meaning things that lead to something else and it can become haram. That's why the Sharia, that's why Allah made this thing haram. So everything else that can lead to harm or lead to haram itself becomes haram. And this was specifically Imam Malik was pushing this the most at his time. Okay? Even if that thing of temptation or whatever it may be for the opposite gender was still not there. According to the usuliyin, according to people who pushed Sadd al-Dhara'i', meaning blocking the means, it's still haram. Even though either the woman was not tempted or the man was not tempted of being confined in a room alone and it not leading to haram, still that being alone is still something that the Sharia doesn't allow. So that's something called Sadd al-Dhara'i', blocking the means. So how did the Sharia block the means? Don't be in a room alone with the opposite gender, unless if it's something completely necessary. For instance, if you have to go to the emergency room or you have to do some medical thing and there's nobody else for a woman to take care of a woman or a man to take care of a man, then Islamically are allowed. Because there's an axiom in Islam, it's called al-dururat tubih al-mahdurat, that if something becomes durura, if something becomes incumbent upon you to do, if the means of this world force you to do something, then which was once haram becomes halal. And there's other saying in Sharia that says, إِذَا دَاقَتُ الْأُمُورِ, that if everything becomes restricted onto you from the worldly things, then the Sharia opens up for you. Meaning that something becomes very hard for you to do, then everything becomes more lax. And that's the understanding of somebody eating swine if they don't have any food. If they don't have any food to eat, or if they don't have anything to drink, the alcohol becomes halal for them to survive. So which was once halal for them, right? Which was once haram for them becomes halal for them because of these circumstances. Okay? And that was the general usul of Imam Malik. We can try to get, as talk about usul more as if we wanted to, but usul is one of those things people study their whole life, and we can't cover it within a fraction of 2 hours. The next thing, and we're most likely going to conclude with this, inshallah, because it's 9:30 right now, is the Muwatta of Imam Malik. The Muwatta of Imam Malik was his book of hadith that we mentioned before. Imam Bukhari had his book of hadith, Imam Muslim had his book of hadith, Imam Nasa'i, Imam Tirmidhi. But the first book ever to be written in this way, and what do I mean by this way? All the books of hadith, they combine things that had to do with fiqh, right? Rules, regulations, tahara, salat, and things like virtues of going to the masjid and all those other things, virtues of being nice to your family, virtues of doing this. But Imam Malik designed his chapters in a way that it had to do with the chapters of fiqh. Meaning that he designed this book of hadith, and it was the first of its kind, that I'm gathering, he said, I'm gathering and compiling this book of hadith that has to do with the chapters of fiqh. For instance, the Muwatta Imam Malik would start with tahara. Other places would start with the virtues of knowledge, like Imam Bukhari, he starts off with innamal a'malu binniyat. Most of the books of hadith start with innamal a'malu binniyat, and it became a tradition. And then they would start with, the beauty of niyyah, the virtues of niyyah, the beauty of iman, of ilm, and all knowledge and all that kind of stuff. But Imam Malik starts with, the niyyah and tahara, and salah, and zakah, and sawm, and hajj. So he designed this new way of studying hadith, and you're studying fiqh at the same time. And when this way got popular, everyone started delving deep inside of this, his contemporaries, and not only did they design that way, but it expanded their horizons. Because if you look at hadith in a certain way, as designing it with virtues, and then in fiqh, right? You have a certain way of looking at that book. But when you design it the way Imam Malik did, you're forced to delve inside of this book and extract rulings from it better than you would in any other way. So Imam Malik was known for this. He started to compile this book when he was in the era of the Abbasi era, and Al-Mansur asked him, the person who was before him, he said to him, he gave him advice. He said, why don't you design a constitution for us, for our rulership, for our khilafah, that everyone can follow? And he said this to him at Hajj, when they met at Hajj. And he said that, this is the way I deduce things, but everybody's different, and I don't want to oblige everybody, the hadith and the extrapolation they have from the hadith, from the way I do things, because there's other ways of doing things. There's an Imam of Kufa in Baghdad, which was Imam Abu Hanifa. There were other Imams in other places. And he said, if I limit just to my way of deduction, then I'll be oppressing somebody. Even to the point where Harun al-Rashid, when he was the Khalifa, he said that we're going to make the Muwatta Imam Malik, the constitution, and we're going to hang it on the Kaaba for everybody to see. Because the practice of the Kaaba before Islam was what? When the people of Jahiliyyah, before Islam came, they used to hang their poetry on the Kaaba. And whoever was the best in poetry, that's who used to get that position or that place reserved for them for hanging the poetry on the Kaaba. Because that's what was at that time. That was eloquence of the Arabic language was for that time. So when Muhammad ﷺ came, we all know the story, that when he read the Quran, they knew right away that this was not the work of a man, meaning this Quran that he was reading, because it was different from the poetry that was hung on the Kaaba. Right? So when it was a time of the era of hadith, and Allah brought this ummah in different eras, he said, Harun al-Rashid, who was the Khalifa at that time, he said, we're going to hang the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and he asked for permission of Imam Malik, and Imam Malik refused. He said, we can't make the constitution because this is the way I deduced it from Medina, and this is a place of international arena, which was the Kaaba, and for all the Ummah, I'm not doing this for the whole entire Ummah. Which tells you something about these Imams. When they made their madhab, or formed their madhab, or constructed this madhab for the ease of the Ummah to practice the Quran and the Sunnah, they didn't expect to have this humongous following. They just thought that there was a responsibility that they had to take upon themselves to make everybody's life easier because they felt they had the tools. Little did they know that there was going to be 1 billion people sharing four madhabs, and this is something that he had a lot of hikmah in saying, so they didn't end up doing that. They didn't end up hanging the Muwatta on the Kaaba for everyone to look at and learn from. Now, as far as the Muwatta of Imam Malik is concerned, how it works is, and I'm starting with Bukhari because everybody knows of Bukhari, and I feel not enough people know about the Muwatta. But as far as Bukhari is concerned, there's people who heard these hadiths from Imam Bukhari, right? So that means there's few different riwayat of Sahih al-Bukhari taken from his students, and they dispersed it out to everybody else, okay? So, according to Imam Malik, since there were so many ulama at the time, like 90 plus ulama that were known to be mujtahideen, meaning strong jurists who were capable of having their own madhab, but they would be learning from Imam Malik. So it was said there's anywhere between 20 to 30 different riwayat of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So how this works is, Imam Malik would compile all these hadith and he would mention these hadith to people and they would write it down. Person A who would write it, that would be the riwayah, for instance, of Imam Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, who was one of the people who wrote the riwayat of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Who was Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani? We talked about that last month. Anybody remember? Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani. I called him Imam Muhammad last month. Imam Muhammad was one of the three people who formed the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, which is the Hanafi madhab. Which means a third of the Hanafi madhab is the sayings of Imam Abu Hanifa, a third of it is the sayings of Imam Abu Yusuf, and a third of it are the sayings of Imam Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani. Okay? So Imam Muhammad, not only was he the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, but who was he the student of? Imam Malik. He learned hadith, a big portion of hadith, from Imam Malik. He said, I heard about this Imam, who's the Imam of Medina. There's no way, it's impossible for me not to benefit from him. Look at this justice that people have with ilm, and not having that tendency of being, on a team, sticking to that team only. So he went and he learned the Muwatta of Imam Malik from Imam Malik, and he has his own narration and sanad. That Muwatta is called the Muwatta Imam Muhammad, narrated from Imam Malik. Okay? There's also the Muwatta, the other very popular one, which was from Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi al-Andalusi, which means that he wrote and transcribed all these hadith that Imam Malik narrated from whom? Imam Malik narrated from An-Nafi', who narrated from Abdullah ibn Umar, who narrated from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, or he narrated from Umar, who heard from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And this is what we call the chain, the golden chain of narration, which was that Imam Malik heard from Nafi', heard from Abdullah ibn Umar, heard from Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is the golden chain of narration, the strongest chain of narration, according to the majority of the muhaddithin, the ulama of hadith, including Imam Bukhari. And guess what book is full of it? The Muwatta of Imam Malik. The Muwatta of Imam Malik, which is what pushed Imam Shah Waliullah Dahlawi and many other Imams, saying that after the Quran, the strongest book to depend upon for the Sharia is the Muwatta Imam Malik, and number 3 is the book of Imam Bukhari. So there were about 20 to 30 different versions of the Muwatta of Imam Malik, written by his students, but 2 of them reached us in a very, very successful, complete manner. Some of them reached us with maybe 100 hadith, some of them reached us maybe 200 hadith, but the complete ones are the one from Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani and Imam Yahya al-Andalusi. Okay? Imam Malik, and one thing to understand is that they both had slightly different chapters inside of the book. Who was Imam Muhammad and who? Imam Yahya al-Andalusi Bukhari, because it's a long name. I'm just saying this so all of us memorize this, inshallah, because this is a part of our culture and a part of our heritage, of how we receive the Quran and the Sunnah. So they had slightly different hadith inside of them, meaning some of them included hadith A and the other one included hadith B, and they didn't match up 100%, I should say, as far as the chapters, the order of the chapters, and as far as the hadith that were included inside of it. This was for the sole purpose that it was understood that Imam Malik, rahimahullah, radiallahu anh, he used to, at times, specifically engage himself in these hadith and felt they were best and be fit for this time. And when Imam al-Andalusi approached him, who was the other one, who took all of the Muwatta with him, he felt that, meaning Imam Malik felt that it was best to teach these hadith at that time. And to clarify what I mean by that is, Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah, when he wrote his book of Usul, which is Ar-Risala, he basically reviewed it 40 times before he published it. or made it open to the public. And he said that after I wrote it, I couldn't get any sleep, so I'd get up and I'd correct. And I'd correct. And then the next day, I knew something might have been missing, so I corrected. And he said after doing this 40 times, and this took more than 40 days. This is not something easy. He said after doing this 40 days, I figured al-kamalullah, that perfection is from Allah, and I published my book. So at times you will see somebody who was a mufti from amongst the Sahaba or the Tabi'een, his fatwa was in a certain way or a certain understanding in the first period of his life, and a certain understanding from a different period of his life. Now, as far as the Hanafi madhab is concerned, in every single seminar that we have, I'm going to mention the previous ulama just so we refresh things. So as we said, Imam Muhammad was 1/3 of the Hanafi madhab, right? So if he differed with Imam Hanifa, and Imam Hanifa said, you're right, we're going to go with this, and this is going to be the final word of what we call the final word in the madhab, that's what it's going to be. So Imam Muhammad is 1/3 of the madhab, Imam Abu Yusuf is 1/3 of the madhab, and Imam Hanifa is 1/3 of the madhab. After Imam Muhammad learned hadith and fiqh from Imam Malik, do you think that he stayed stagnant and stayed on those opinions that he learned originally from Imam Hanifa? What do you guys think?
Sorry, what was the question?
If Imam Muhammad, who was a student of Imam Hanifa, studied from Imam Malik after he studied with Imam Hanifa, and he studied the Muwatta with him, and got ijazah from Muwatta with him, meaning he studied hadith and fiqh from Imam Malik, do you think he originally, what he went with, which was the madhab of Imam Hanifa, and came to Medina, did he stay on the similar opinions that he did? No, he didn't. He changed a big portion of his madhab because he went and benefited from another mujtahid, and he learned from him, and he filled in, if you want to call the blanks, and he would pass his fatwa accordingly. And this is how all the imams will benefit from each other. Imam al-Shafi'i, and I'm going to conclude with these stories, inshallah. I know I said it before, but there's a lot of detail and I don't want to leave anything out. Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, when he first studied with the ulama of Hanafiya for 8 years, who were the imams of Baghdad, he studied from them, and then again he went to Medina and Mecca, and then he formed his own madhab when he formed his book called Al-Umm. He had another book which was called, it might be Al-Hujjah. But then after he studied in Medina and Mecca, he came out with another book called Al-Umm, which was refined and changed a little bit. And they came to the conclusion that the ulama, the true ulama who were mujtahideen, they would pass judgments according to the environment that they lived in, according to the places that they lived in. It doesn't mean that you compromise and make up things. It means you take that same ruh of the sharia, and this is not for the general layman to do. This is what was the role of the mujtahideen. They would take the environment they live in, and then look at the Quran and the Sunnah and apply it inside of this. It doesn't mean that they would have to compromise. That's not what I'm saying here. It means that there's certain things that were allowed to be swayed in the Sharia, they would sway it. Okay?
So you are saying, in other words, the hadith is there.
Yes.
The application would be different based.
The application, yes. A good example of that would be, for instance, is the hadith of what we talked about last month, is of At-Tahiyyat al-Masjid. Right? Is that they would have one hadith, but they would look at it in a different way. For instance, all the imams, they used this one hadith of Muhammad ﷺ when he was giving the khutbah on the mimbar, and a sahabi came and he sat down without praying 2 rakat tahiyyat al-masjid. Okay? Muhammad ﷺ was giving a khutbah on Jum'ah, leading the sahaba in Jum'ah. One sahabi comes, or one individual comes, sits down without praying tahiyyat al-masjid. Muhammad ﷺ stops his khutbah and he said, aren't you going to pray 2 rakat? Aren't you going to pray 2 rakat? So he stood up and he finished praying. Okay? Now there's different hadith of the understanding of hadith. Did Muhammad ﷺ stop the khutbah completely to let him finish? Or did he continue giving the khutbah while he was praying? Okay, now there's something that has to be looked at this as far as using the same hadith but deducing different things from it and different environments that you're in. Okay? Number one thing is ways of deduction, or ways of extrapolating rulings from this hadith. Number one way is of the Jamhur, which was the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, and a portion of the Malikis. They said that from the hadith, from the face value of hadith, it shows us the importance of praying these 2 rakat tahiyyat al-masjid, that even Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam had to stop his khutbah that he was leading the Sahaba in order for this person to pray, and he told him, aren't you going to pray these 2 rakat? أَلَا تُصَلِّي رَكْعَتَيْنِ? Aren't you going to pray these 2 rakat? Muhammad said to him. Okay? Clear, right? Very easy. Taken from the face value of the hadith. The other understanding was of the Hanafis and a portion of the Malikis, but mainly the Hanafis. They said, no, we have to look at this hadith and look at it in a different type of lens and look in depth. Why did Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam say this? They said Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said and told this person and ordered him and stopped his khutbah because he wanted to get the attention of the Sahaba to this new individual that came and prayed amongst them, that the Sahaba never seen, and he had athar al-safar on him, meaning that he had all types of dust on him and sand, and he had ripped clothing, he looked very poor. So Muhammad ﷺ was directing the attention of the Sahaba at this time called the khutbah of this poor man, saying, look at him in an indirect way and help him after we're done with the prayer. Okay? You see how they both use the same hadith, but they have 2 different ways of looking at the hadith. So for that reason, according to the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, it's wajib to pray the 2 rakat tahiyyat al-masjid regardless. And it's almost to the level of a fard basically. Basically fard and wajib is synonymous for the Shafi'is. Okay? So for them it was something like a fard, almost like a fard. No matter what's happening, except for a fard prayer, you have to pray tahiyyat al-masjid. So according to the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, if you were to come in to the masjid and the khutbah is going on, you have to pray tahiyyat al-masjid. Okay? Or as soon as you come into the masjid, you pray tahiyyat al-masjid. Okay? According to the Hanafis, no, it's mustahab or it's sunnah. Meaning that you have a choice, it's better to do it, but if the khutbah is going on, you sit down and you listen to the khutbah, according to the Hanafis, and you pray your tahiyyat al-masjid at another time. Meaning for some other time or reason. Okay? But now what comes to place and time is a perfect understanding of Imam Malik mentioning many of his hadith and him saying that I didn't see the people of Medina doing it where I live, so I didn't make this something fard in my usul or in my fiqh. And when I constantly say usul, why am I mentioning that? Is because when somebody does something in their fiqh, for instance doing the tahiyyat al-masjid, that's for a reason of usul. The reason why usul al-fiqh is called usul al-fiqh is because it means the origins of fiqh. And usul in a tree originally means what? The roots, right? And maybe the stump, and the furu'a, which are the branches, are what you would call the fiqh. So based on the usul and how they looked at the hadith and extrapolated all the rulings, they would disperse the rulings based on that understanding of how we said tahiyyat al-masjid, for instance. That tahiyyat al-masjid, they looked at that hadith, which was the usul, which was the origin, right? They looked at it in a certain way, delved inside of it, found reasonings, and dispersed these understandings, what we call fiqh. But the origins of fiqh is usul al-fiqh. So the reason why somebody does something different, an imam did something different, is not because of his fiqh, because of his usul. He had a certain understanding of looking at the hadith, looking at an ayah, extrapolating rulings, and then dispersing his knowledge out to everybody else. And I took up a lot more time than I was supposed to, and we're going to conclude with this. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.
قالوا محمد مولي محمد